Howdy folks, Dominic here. Before we begin, a quick note. First of all, let me apologize once again for the difference in audio quality for this episode. My wife and I are now in the UK, but we are currently living in temporary housing while we search for something more permanent. So I'm still not in an ideal situation for quality recording. Hopefully, it's not too distracting. Also, for those who are interested, I will soon be announcing another tour to Egypt, this time for November 2025. The official announcement, including the itinerary and links, will go up in a few days. So if you'd like to visit Egypt this year, now is the time to think about it. Anyways, on with the news. In February 2025, the breaking news was the discovery of a royal tomb. An archaeological mission working in Luxor are confident that they have located the grave of King Thutmose II. The tomb itself was discovered in late 2022, and the team announced it publicly in 2023. I reported on that initial find in the news roundup for that year. Now, another season has passed, and the team's work has come to fruition. The project is a joint venture between the Supreme Council of Antiquities, a branch of the Egyptian government, and the New Kingdom Research Foundation, which is affiliated with Cambridge University in the UK. The project is led by Dr. Piers Litherland, who has directed missions to this region for just over a decade. I'll give a bit more background on the project another time. For now, let's talk about the big event. Dr. Litherland's team are now confident that they have discovered the tomb of King Thutmose II. Thutmose, or Aa-Keper-en-Ra Jehuti-Mesu, lived and reigned around 1500 BCE. His rule is murky. It may have been as short as 3 years or as long as 13, depending which scholar you follow. Whatever its duration, this king is one of the lesser-known figures of the 18th dynasty. Far more famous is Thutmose's wife, Hatshepsut. As king and queen, Thutmose and Hatshepsut, who were half-siblings through their father, led the Egyptian government and its colonial empire around 1500 BCE. But when Thutmose died, possibly quite young, Hatshepsut took over the government. Her story is legendary, for good reason, but poor Thutmose II gets a bit overshadowed in the histories of that era. This new discovery might improve his visibility. When Thutmose died, his half-sister/widow Hatshepsut arranged his burial. Normally, that job would fall to his eldest son, but the king's boy, Thutmose III, was just an infant when his father died. So, as we all see, it was Hatshepsut who stepped forward and orchestrated the rites. The queen buried her husband/predecessor in a tomb, and she must have done a good job of it, because the mummy of Thutmose II survived to the modern day. His body was discovered in 1881 in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri. Ironically, that cache was located quite close to the great temple of Hatshepsut herself. Within that cache, ancient priests had reburied the king, labelled his mummy, given him a new coffin, and laid him to rest. Now, Thutmose II lies in state in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in eastern Cairo. The survival of that mummy and its reburial in the cache suggested that Thutmose II had a tomb somewhere in the Luxor region. Unfortunately, that monument had never been found in the Valley of the Kings, nor was it closer to the Nile in the hills near Deir el-Bahri or other valleys. Thutmose II's burial remained a question mark, a gap in the archaeological record. Until now. After 2 years of work, the New Kingdom Research Foundation is confident that they have located the missing tomb in which Thutmose was originally buried. The monument is located southwest from the Valley of the Kings, in a lesser-known cemetery. Here you will find burials of royal women and children. For example, one of the nearby tombs belonged to Queen Hatshepsut, Thutmose's wife. It was constructed when she was just a queen, quote-unquote, and was abandoned after she made herself pharaoh. Another tomb nearby belongs to Princess Neferura, the daughter of Hatshepsut and Thutmose. So this area has long been associated with this family and period, but nobody expected to find a king's tomb in this vicinity. The discovery came in late 2022, as the team were probing sites near to other previously discovered tombs. An excavator named Ashraf Omar located the entrance to the monument. A staircase descending into the rock emerged from the rubble and debris. At the bottom, a doorway connecting to a corridor and chambers beyond. Architecturally, the monument seemed to follow the dimensions and layout of an 18th dynasty tomb. That made sense, given the nearby tombs of queens and princesses from that very period. So at first, the team assumed they had found another of these royal family monuments. An exciting find, but nothing too dramatic. Unfortunately, the monument was in poor condition. Flooded repeatedly, its ceiling had collapsed, and most of the passages and chambers were full of debris. Again, we'll cover the full story of the tomb in future. But as the team worked through the rubble, they started finding small fragments that matched an 18th dynasty date. So far, so good. But who was the owner? That part was trickier. Among the debris, the team found two names. One was the cartouche of King Thutmose II, the other his wife, Queen Hatshepsut. That gave the excavators a starting date. The tomb probably belonged to the early 18th dynasty, around 1500 BCE. Again, so far so good. In late 2023, project lead Piers Litherland published a short article in the magazine Egyptian Archaeology. That article went through the initial phase of discovery and excavation, and Dr. Litherland tentatively suggested that the owner of the tomb might actually be King Thutmose himself. There were good reasons for suspecting this, which I'll explain in a moment, but in that first phase of excavation, the tomb required a great deal of work. The team would need more information before they could be certain. Now they have it. In 2025, the excavators are confident that the tomb does in fact belong to Thutmose II, that it was made in his reign for his burial, and that, once upon a time, it held his mummy and funerary goods. What changed between 2022 and 2025 to give them more certainty? Well, the team presents two pieces of evidence. Exhibit A is a section of the tomb's decoration. In the main burial chamber, bits of plaster on the northern wall bore hieroglyphs and imagery. These hieroglyphs came from a funerary text, which we know as the Amduat, or that which is in the underworld. The Amduat describes the nighttime journey of the sun god Ra and his emergence in the next dawn. Now, that may not sound like much, but it is quite significant. During the 18th dynasty, the Amduat is a royal text, restricted to the tombs of kings. For a monument of this period to have the Amduat in its burial chamber, that suggests quite strongly that the owner was a king. Okay, fair enough, but that's a little bit abstract, right? This could be an exception to the Amduat only for kings rule. So what other evidence do we have? Well, Exhibit B is a piece of stone, originally the rim of a vase. It bears a line of hieroglyphs along its edge. If you've seen any of the news articles advertising the discovery, this stone rim is the centerpiece photo. The hieroglyphs are formulaic, but significant. They say, quote, "The god's wife, the king's great wife, Hatshepsut, she has made it, the tomb, as her monument for her brother, the good god, the lord of the two lands, Aa-Keperenra, Thutmose II, who lives forever, the Osiris." End quote. This one is a smoking gun, or smoking jar. The stone piece seems to be a broken vase, probably a jar for ointment or oils. It's hard to tell from the photos. Fortunately, the text is clear. The tomb was used as the burial place for King Thutmose II, and that funeral was overseen by his half-sister/wife, Queen Hatshepsut, and she claims credit as the maker of this monument. As far as burial records go, it doesn't get much clearer than that. Combine the stone jar with the wall decoration that shows the amduat, and the team is quite confident in their conclusion. This monument is probably the original tomb of King Thutmose II, the place where, following his death, Queen Hatshepsut buried him. The king's mummy, lying in a coffin and surrounded by goods, once rested in this tomb. The walls bore scenes and texts of his journey into the underworld, the duat, and the inscribed material signed Hatshepsut's work in burying her predecessor. The monument was sealed, the king vanished into history. Of course, that's obviously not the whole story. We have this tomb in a broken condition, and we have the mummy of Thutmose II. How did those two things get separated? Well, from the very start of the excavation, it was clear that the tomb had suffered catastrophic flooding. Torrential rains pouring down the cliff face above had broken the tomb's door and washed mud and debris into the passages. That flooding had inundated the burial chambers themselves, probably shattering many of the fragile items, wood, terracotta, organic material. The king's sarcophagus, which was stone, may have been okay, tightly sealed and protected, so the body of Thutmose, lying in its coffin, might have been secure. But outside his casket, the chamber filled with water, mud, and stone, a true immersion in the waters of chaos. The exact date of this flooding is unclear, but the team suggests it may have been just a few years after the burial. Whenever it was, exactly, the next phase is easy enough to guess. Thutmose's successors, possibly Hatshepsut herself, sent a party of workers to remove the king from his grave. The ancient team sifted through the debris, perhaps after the water had subsided or drained into the limestone bedrock. Accessing the burial chamber, they systematically removed the burial goods of the king. Furniture, vases, coffins, and even the stone sarcophagus came out of the monument. The archaeological team say that on the tomb's entrance and staircases, there are still scrapes and marks from where the sarcophagus was physically dragged out of the tomb. Now, that's an important point. The monument could have been violated by tomb robbers who removed all the burial goods and furnishings. But thieves usually don't touch these sarcophagi. The stone caskets are too heavy to remove, and even in a worst-case scenario, they might smash them to pieces, but they rarely take them out. The fact that somebody went to the trouble of removing it suggests, quite strongly, that this clearance was official. So where did the king's burial goods and his mummy eventually go? Well, that is the next frontier, a chapter still to come. You see, Dr. Litherland suspects that this king might have another tomb nearby. The valley in which Thutmose's tomb was located remains a work in progress. Although archaeologists past and present have surveyed this region and excavated some of the monuments, it is quite a large area, and as we know from the Valley of the Kings, you might think you've found everything, but until you dig down to the bedrock in as many places as possible, you can't be sure what has been missed. Dr. Litherland and his team are now embarking on that phase of the work, to clear rubble and detritus from as many areas as possible to see if anything remains hidden. And they are cautiously optimistic that there could be another important find. The team is looking at an area close to Thutmose's tomb in a different section of the valley. According to early reports, there is evidence for ancient building work in this region. There is the limestone debris, flakes, and rubble that you might expect from digging and quarrying. There are artifacts like pottery and broken chisels left by the ancient workers. And on top of that detritus, there is a layer of plaster and ash, as if somebody had intentionally covered up their work. Finally, the ancients seem to have broken part of the cliff away, dropping huge slabs of limestone over the top of the rubble. The slabs are about the size of a dining table, and they seem to have a plaster mortar holding them in place. According to the excavators, it is quite likely that the ancients were trying to bury something and protect it thoroughly. That's a lot of work for a normal quote-unquote burial, which leads Dr. Litherland to suggest, quote, "The best candidate for what is hidden underneath this enormously expensive pile is the second tomb of Thutmose II." End quote. Now, these are just preliminary statements quoted in news articles. The team has weeks or months of work ahead of them before they can identify what, if anything, is left in this area. But they seem confident about their prospects, confident enough to suggest that the tomb they have found is just the first in a much larger discovery. But here we move into the realm of educated speculation, and I thought it best to get somebody familiar with these sorts of questions in to explain the situation as it stands. After the break, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Chris Naunton, the former director of the Egypt Exploration Society in the UK, and author of such books as Searching for the Lost Tombs of Egypt, published in 2018. Dr. Naunton is well versed in the missing monuments, especially of the New Kingdom, and I thought it would be good to hear his thoughts on the discovery, its archaeological and historical significance, and the possibility of more finds to come. That is after the break. See you in a moment. And now, please welcome Dr. Chris Naunton, who joins us from Luxor to discuss the new discovery. So, good morning or good afternoon, Dr. Naunton. Welcome back to the History of Egypt podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much for having me back, Dominic. It's good of you to have me back.
So you're currently speaking to us from Luxor, is that correct? You're on a tour.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm here with a group for just a week. Mostly in Luxor. We're going to have a night in Abydos as well, but otherwise a sort of deep dive, or as far as you can dive deeply into sites and monuments in Luxor in a week. So yeah, good fun. We're kind of loosely sort of Hatshepsut Thutmose III themed, loosely.
Yep.
Anyway, all good fun.
Well, that's very appropriate, because obviously I want to talk to you today about the new tomb of Hatshepsut's husband / half-brother, Thutmose II, which has just been formally announced to actually be his tomb. So my first question to you, sort of just generally big picture, is what is the significance of finding this particular royal tomb in terms of the New Kingdom burial sepulchres? We have most of them, but some of them were missing. There are a couple that we might have it, we might not. So how does this stack up in terms of filling out the record? Do we now have all of them, or are there still a couple missing?
Well, I think you ask all the sort of really pertinent questions there, really. And you're quite right to point out that we have almost all the tombs of the kings of the New Kingdom, which makes this tomb, it means that it was a kind of conspicuous gap. And actually, there are other gaps, but those can all be, I think, they can all be explained one way or another. One of the defining features of the New Kingdom is the use of the Valley of the Kings as the royal cemetery. Its use almost starts at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, and it finishes with the end of the 20th dynasty. So the other kind of gaps would be right at the very beginning of the 18th dynasty, probably before the time that the Valley of the Kings was begun. You've got the Amarna period, which of course is very confused and confusing and involves a move to Amarna anyway. So if there are gaps there, then there's some sort of an explanation there. The tomb of Ramesses VIII is missing, but then by that point, again, we're into a fairly high turnover of kings, and he may have been sort of ephemeral. And Thutmose II, as as a reasonably well-known, if not terribly well-known, terribly well-attested king from a period when we think the Valley of the Kings is already in use, and from a time when Egypt is sort of strong and stable and we're not getting ephemeral rulers. For that tomb to be missing was a bit weird. And now it's not. So that gap is filled, even if it's filled in a way that sort of still begs a few questions. I guess that's the best way.
Sure. And in terms of how this sort of fits in with the immediate period around Thutmose II, when Hatshepsut is queen, she builds a tomb, or a tomb is built for her pretty close by to this royal tomb. And their mutual daughter, Neferura, also has a tomb there. If I could ask you to speculate sort of wildly, do you think this was perhaps the tomb he originally planned to build, or was it possibly one that was arranged when he died, perhaps unexpectedly?
It's really that is the big question, isn't it? Really, it seems, with hindsight and with the benefit of knowing what happens in the later 18th dynasty, in the 19th and the 20th, we know that the Valley of the Kings becomes established at this early point. You get the sense that maybe they're sort of hunting around for the perfect burial place. So KV20 is probably the tomb that we think Hatshepsut herself was eventually buried in, alongside her father Thutmose I, even if only briefly. That's probably the first tomb to be cut in what becomes the Valley of the Kings. But maybe for some reason after this point they decide, well, we weren't really sure if that was quite right. Maybe they decide to move on. On the other hand, this tomb that's now been discovered, C4, is pretty small. It's kind of oddly configured. You've got this sort of 2-corridor arrangement. It looks like that's probably the result of a change of plan. It doesn't really seem to conform. It doesn't really sit very nicely in what seems to be the development of the royal tomb in the early New Kingdom. So given that we have other reasons to think that maybe Thutmose II died early and unexpectedly, yeah, I think that there is a possibility that it wasn't the intention that he should be buried here. It's impossible to know that. I just wonder if they're just still hunting around for the right place. And we also know from C4 that this tomb suffers very badly from flooding. And, maybe they thought they'd got the perfect location far, far, far away from where people are living, far away from robbers. We assume that's part of the reason why the Valley of the Kings is chosen in the first place. So they go all that way, only to then find that the tomb gets destroyed within a few years. So, maybe this is not such a great place. Having said that, there's also now this possibility that the archaeologists, the discoverer of Piers Litherland of this new tomb, thinks that there is maybe yet another tomb nearby, which might prove that actually, well, no, they weren't then thinking about going back to the Valley of the Kings. They were still, decided that these far distant Western Wadis are the place.
So a few years ago, you published a book called Searching for the Lost Tombs of Egypt. And subsequently, you published a book about Egyptologists' notebooks. So we know that Howard Carter and people like him did survey and excavation work in these Western Wadis in the early 1900s. To your understanding, or as far as you can tell from your research, how far down towards the bedrock did people like Carter actually go? Obviously that area hasn't been fully explored because we found this new tomb. But do you think it's quite likely that there will be other undiscovered tombs in this region?
It does seem very possible. I mean, Carter certainly didn't, clear the whole area down to the bedrock. I mean, it's important to emphasize this is the Valley of the Kings itself is in some ways inconveniently located, but it's, by comparison with the Western Wadis, it seems quite close to civilization. Of course, there's now a tarmac road and all that sort of thing. There's no such facilities in the Western Wadis. It would have been that bit harder for archaeologists to get out there. I think I suspect Carter probably had enough of a sniff round to decide that. Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because he always wanted to work in the Valley of the Kings, and eventually does come to work there, and of course has no reason or no need ever to go back to the Western Wadis looking for something sensational, having discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun, which is never going to be trumped. Um, I wonder actually if he might have had it in mind, if supposing he hadn't had that last season in the Valley of the Kings, or what was supposed to be his last season, and found the tomb of King Tut, or if somebody else had got there first or whatever. I wonder if he hadn't made his great discovery, if he might have made his way back to the Western Wadis. He clearly didn't finish the job, as it were. What's really interesting, actually, about the recent New Kingdom Research Foundation work is that it seemed for a while as though they had moved away from the wadis that Carter and co were looking at, Wadi A, C, F in particular, towards the Wadi Barriya, which is this great big wide wadi, a little bit to the sort of south and west, and they had found they'd made some quite promising discoveries there. Royal family members of the later 18th dynasty connected with the time of Amenhotep III. And it looked at that point a few years ago as though that was going to be, and I thought it seemed as though they were saying, oh no, actually we had previously thought maybe, the area that Carter had mapped, maybe that was the place, but actually no, it's the Wadi Barriya. And then here we are, we're back in Wadi C, with more discoveries and apparently more to come. So I mean, we can only really go on what the archaeologists who were on the spot say, but they seem to be confident that there's going to be more to be found, which would be very exciting.
Okay, so that kind of dovetails nicely to the suggestion that there might be a second burial monument very close to C4. So Dr. Litherland and the team have suggested this might be the true burial of Thutmose II. Given the fact that we have a mummy in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which was discovered in the 1881 cache, the body itself had labels, the coffin had labels, seeming to suggest that the ancient priests believed very strongly this was Thutmose II. In your understanding of the caches and that process, how likely is it, just probability-wise, that they might have got it wrong, that this might not actually be his mummy?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's any great need for us to doubt that the labels on the mummy and the coffin, in the case of the mummy that's currently identified as Thutmose II, are mistaken or they're inaccurate or whatever. The doubt is being raised now because analysis of that mummy, the human remains themselves, by anatomists, medical analysis, seem to show that the mummy is that of somebody who died at around 30 years old, and there is we think we don't have good evidence that Thutmose III reigned for a long time. There's also this inscription, which is a bit oblique. That seems to suggest that he was young when he came to the throne. So if you take those two things together, if he was, let's say 10 years old for the sake of argument, and he only reigns for half a dozen or so years at most, then that mummy, that 30-year-old mummy, can't be Thutmose II, in which case it's got to be somebody else, in which case we don't have a mummy for Thutmose II. I think that for me, we don't know for certain how long Thutmose II reigned for. It does seem likely. I don't think we've got good reason to think that he did reign for a long time, but it's not impossible. And it's always the case. Well, it's usually the case that we guesstimate reign lengths on the basis of highest attested regnal dates, or sometimes comparison with Manetho, or very occasionally there's synchronisms or corroborating evidence that allows us to say, okay, actually this king certainly did die after year whatever. But it's seems to be not impossible in this case that, one day somebody might just turn up an inscription of Thutmose II year 25, in which case textbooks have to be changed. It doesn't seem very likely, but it's not impossible. The other thing is that there's only that one very oblique reference. I think the phrase is something like, the king was as a falcon in the nest or something at the time he came to the throne, which is interpreted to mean that, like a very young bird, like a chick that's just hatched from the egg in the nest, Thutmose II comes to the throne as a child. We don't know that that's the correct interpretation. It seems to me that that could simply mean that he was quite young, as pharaohs go when they exceed the throne, which could mean he was a baby, or it could mean he was 18. So again, we know that in the royal cache, we know that things did get mixed up and things are mislabeled here and there. But generally speaking, we take the mummies to belong to the people whose names are written on the dockets, on the labels, and on the coffins. And generally speaking, we've taken that to be reliable. So it's a bit difficult not to think here that, what's happened is that we've got a royal tomb. Unfortunately, it's been found empty. They think there might be something else. And, the temptation to think, maybe there's another tomb of the same king is just proven to be overwhelming. But actually, it still seems unlikely to me. I'm very happy to be proven wrong. If that tomb gets found and it's got the mummy of Thutmose II in, I'll be as happy as anybody else.
Obviously, this is a position neither of us or many of us have ever been put in. So I imagine the temptation must be very strong to get excited about the possibilities accompanying a discovery like this.
Yeah, and it just feels a little bit familiar to me as well. That I just feel as though I've heard it too many times before that we are just a few days away from finding this, or we're definitely going to find that. That feels a bit mean. Like I say, I'm absolutely behind Dr. Litherland and his team. It is obviously difficult not to get not to sort of envision something, not to imagine something, and then get a bit carried away with that thing. Of course, we all know very well that in archaeology, you just absolutely can't predict what's going to be what's going to be awaiting you beneath the spade or whatever. It's not a phrase. You know what I mean?
And as always, I guess the best we can say is we'll wait and see.
Yeah, exactly. But it's exciting, and I argued in my book that in some ways the whole of my Lost Tombs book was all about trying to convey something of the sense of the thrill and excitement and anticipation, and the fact that archaeology is not finished, and that there are going to be more discoveries. So the idea that we might be actually quite close to something very exciting is not one we should just squash, provided we equip ourselves with all the right information and evidence, I think.
One last question, sort of the kind of the hypothetical next phase. If we assume, based on the evidence we have, that the mummy in the Nemek is indeed Thutmose II, that would logically suggest that he had been reburied somewhere, perhaps KV20, somewhere like that, a place that was known well enough for his body to subsequently be removed and placed in the cache. If we take that as the sort of logical sequence of events that must have led to his mummy surviving to the modern day, that doesn't preclude the possibility that there is a second tomb to be found in which he was reburied after C4 was flooded. Could we perhaps expect that if such a tomb does exist, it might still contain funerary objects from his burial? Because Dr. Litherland does note that items from his burial don't seem to have been recovered anywhere, or they're not in museums. Is it possible that the tomb at least contains a cache of, canopic jars, funerary fragmentary items that might have survived?
Yeah, possibly. Although Although, when it comes to, say, the tombs of Ahmose I or Amenhotep I, who are very close in the sequence to Thutmose II, bodies turned up in the cache. In those cases, we don't have more than tiny little bits and bobs, and I think there's a general sort of assumption that most probably Ahmose I, or the most likely Ahmose, fits into the earlier 17th dynasty sequence of Naga tombs. Amenhotep I may also, although there's another couple of tombs that are candidates for having been his in and around sort of Dryabel Naga or Dar Bahri or even Valley of the Kings. But in those cases, again, that sort of material hasn't survived sarcophagi, canopic jars, not in more than fragments.
Mm.
So there are other instances of tombs of kings of almost exactly this period where we don't have those things. So on that basis, either it isn't that weird, and we might not find another tomb of Thutmose II, or flip it around the other way, we might well find another tomb of Thutmose II with all that stuff in, and we might also find the tombs at some point of Ahmose I and Amenhotep I with all that stuff in too. Maybe they're both in Wadi C somewhere as well. I mean, wouldn't it be funny if that tomb that Piers Litherland is about to find, so we're told, turns out to be one of those earlier 18th dynasty kings? That would really put the cat among the pigeons.
I'm not going to open that box right now, because I promised that I would only keep you a few minutes, and I don't want to go over that. So, Chris, that brings me to the end of my questions on this particular tomb. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us, especially you're in the middle of a tour, you have a cold. We greatly appreciate your commentary, so thank you very much.
Very sorry about the sniffles, but thank you very much, Dominic, for asking me.
Absolutely. And hopefully the rest of your tour goes very well. And in future, we would love to have you back on the podcast for a more full discussion on any topic you like when you're refreshed and ready.
Let's definitely do that, and I'll let you know when the sniffle's gone. We can sort of now.
Thank you very much, Chris. Take care.
Cheers. Take care.
My thanks to Dr. Naunton for joining us to discuss this. If you are interested to learn more about his work, you can find references in the episode description. And if you're interested in joining him on one of his tours to Egypt, you can find them via Ancient World Tours, a company in the UK who also facilitate my excursions to Egypt. Again, there'll be a link in the episode description if you are interested. Anyway, let's bring this to a conclusion. In early 2025, the tomb of Thutmose II, King of Egypt around 1500 BCE, has officially been identified. With that, one of the last gaps in the historical record of the royal tombs has been, apparently, closed for good. But the story is definitely not over. At the time of recording, the excavation team still has a lot of work ahead of them before they can prepare the final publications and before they can fully say that everything has been discovered. There might be some important finds on the horizon. For now, we in the public can only wait and see. Hopefully, there is something more. But even if not, the rediscovery of Thutmose II's tomb is an important chapter in the history of the New Kingdom and the archaeology of the Luxor region. No matter what, Dr. Litherland and his team have secured their place in the annals of Egyptology. They have filled an important gap in the history of tomb construction, and hopefully we'll learn a lot from this monument and the ones nearby that can shed light on ancient burial practices, how the Egyptians responded to a crisis such as the flooding of a royal tomb, and perhaps expand the story of King Thutmose II. Thanks for listening.